Growing up, I always felt like I was living in someone else's shadow. My sister, Lily, was the star of the family. She was everything my parents could have hoped for: talented, charming, and, most importantly, their golden child. From the moment she was born, it was like the universe revolved around her, while I, Ethan, was just there. It wasn't just about the attention, it was the way they showed their love. Lily had the best of everything: a room that looked like it belonged in a magazine, complete with pastel walls and custom furniture. Meanwhile, I made do with a small, dimly lit space that barely had room for my hand-me-down bed. Her closet was always filled with new clothes, the kind you'd see on TV. My wardrobe, on the other hand, was a patchwork of her old outfits and the occasional thrift store find. They didn't even try to hide it. Birthdays and holidays were another glaring reminder of how different our worlds were. Lily's celebrations were grand events with cakes from fancy bakeries and gifts wrapped so perfectly they almost felt like taunts. My birthdays? A quiet dinner at home with a single candle on a store-bought cake, if they remembered at all. I remember one particular evening when the unfairness of it all became too much. Lily had just received a new laptop for school. It wasn't even a special occasion, she had simply mentioned she needed it. Watching her unwrap it at the dinner table while I struggled with an ancient, glitchy desktop in the corner felt like a slap in the face. I couldn't hold it in anymore and asked Mom why Lily always seemed to get the best of everything. Her response was as casual as it was crushing. She said Lily was special, and I needed to be understanding. Special. That word echoed in my head for days. It wasn't just a justification, it was a declaration of where I stood in the family hierarchy. No matter how hard I tried, would never be Lily. I wasn't even sure if they wanted me to try. After that, something shifted in me. I stopped trying to compete for their attention. What was the point? They had made their choice clear. Instead, I focused on school, where numbers and facts couldn't play favorites. Books became my escape, and I poured myself into learning, math, science, anything that didn't require anyone's approval but my own. Outside of school, I found solace in art. Sketching gave me a sense of control I didn't have elsewhere. My drawings weren't just pictures, they were my way of expressing everything I couldn't say out loud. The disappointment, the anger, the sadness, it all came out through my pencil. I didn't share this part of my life with anyone. It was mine, and for once, I felt like I had something Lily couldn't overshadow. But even in my little world, Lily's presence loomed large. My parents would brag about her accomplishments to anyone who would listen. Her recitals, her awards, her popularity at school, all of it became their favorite topic of conversation. Meanwhile, my achievements were lucky to get a passing mention. When I brought home a certificate for winning a district-level math competition, it sat unnoticed on the kitchen counter for days until I finally threw it away. By the time I was a teenager, the divide between us felt like an unbridgeable canyon. Lily was the queen of the family, while I was the court jester, expected to stay out of sight and out of mind. The worst part was that Lily didn't even seem to notice. She basked in the love and attention as if it was her birthright, completely unaware of how much it hurt me. Or maybe she did notice and just didn't care. Either way, I stopped wondering about her feelings long ago. It was easier to just focus on my own life, even if it felt like I was building it on an island no one cared to visit. The resentment I felt toward my parents was like a slow-burning fire. Every ignored accomplishment and dismissive comment added fuel to the flames. But rather than letting it consume me, I used it as motivation. If they weren't going to see my worth, I'd make sure the rest of the world did. I didn't need their approval anymore. I'd create my own path, one step at a time, and prove to myself that I was just as special as they claimed Lily was. Looking back, I wonder if things could have been different. Maybe if they had tried to balance their love a little better, I wouldn't have felt so invisible. But at that point, I was done waiting for change. I had spent enough time being the background character in my own story. It was time to take the lead, even if no one else was watching. My grandfather was the only person in my life who truly saw me. Unlike my parents, who seemed blind to anything but Lily's brilliance, he treated me like I mattered. When I was little, he would take me out for walks, telling me stories of his youth and teaching me how to appreciate the small joys in life. He wasn't rich or flashy, but his kindness made up for what my parents lacked. Those moments with him were the only times I felt genuinely valued. Grandpa had this way of making me feel like I wasn't invisible. He'd listen intently to my ramblings about school projects or my sketches, and he'd always encourage me to keep going, no matter how insignificant it might seem to others. It was through him that I learned to find beauty in the mundane. He was my safe haven in a house that often felt cold and indifferent. But safe havens don't last forever. When Grandpa's health began to decline, the warmth in my life started to dim. At first, it was subtle, a slower step, a forgotten story. Then, it became undeniable. Visits to the doctor became frequent, and his once lively eyes grew tired. The day we got the news that he had a terminal illness felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath me. While my parents offered obligatory condolences, their focus quickly shifted back to Lily's latest achievements. My grief wasn't their priority. When Grandpa passed away, I felt like I lost the last person who genuinely cared about me. His absence was like a void that no one seemed interested in filling. While I mourned, my parents busied themselves planning Lily's upcoming piano recital. They barely acknowledged the loss, treating it as just another event on the calendar. I remember sitting in my room, clutching one of Grandpa's old books, wondering how they could move on so easily when I felt like my world had ended. The house grew colder after that. Without Grandpa's quiet reassurance, I was left entirely to navigate my family's indifference. And then came the day that changed everything. Lily, the family's pride and joy, dropped a bombshell: she was pregnant. At just 16, her perfect image cracked, but instead of treating it like a mistake, my parents rallied around her. They turned the house upside down, preparing for the arrival of her baby. For them, it wasn't a scandal, it was an opportunity to prove how supportive they could be of their special daughter. In the chaos, I became an afterthought. My room, the small sanctuary I had carved out for myself, was suddenly deemed necessary for Lily and her baby. My parents told me it was for the good of the family, but their decision spoke volumes. They moved me to the basement, a damp, poorly lit space with concrete walls and a single, flickering bulb. It felt more like a punishment than a compromise. The basement became my new reality. The air was cold, and the faint smell of mildew lingered no matter how much I tried to clean. My belongings were crammed into boxes, and my bed was nothing more than a thin mattress on the floor. Lily, meanwhile, was celebrated like a hero for her courage in becoming a young mother. My parents decorated her new room with pastel colors and baby supplies, turning it into a nursery fit for a magazine. I couldn't help but feel the sting of their priorities. Down in the basement, I had a lot of time to think. At first, it was mostly anger at my parents for their blatant favoritism, at Lily for her obliviousness, and at myself for letting it all get to me. But as the days turned into weeks, that anger transformed into something else: determination. I realized I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for scraps of attention and hoping things would change. If I wanted a better life, I'd have to create it myself. I started to make plans. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I needed to get out of that house. Every sketch I drew and every book I read felt like a step toward freedom. My art became more than just an escape, it became a way to envision a future where I wasn't just surviving but thriving. The basement might have been my cage, but it also became the place where I began to forge my key to freedom. Looking back, that period of my life was both the darkest and the most enlightening. Losing Grandpa and being pushed aside by my family showed me just how little I could rely on them. But it also forced me to rely on myself, to find strength in places I didn't know existed. The basement was where I hit rock bottom, but it was also where I decided I wouldn't stay there forever. When I left home, I had nothing but a small bag of clothes and the sketches I couldn't bear to leave behind. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than that basement. After days of aimlessly walking the streets and sleeping in shelters, I stumbled across a sign that would change my life: Tom's Auto Repair, Help Wanted. Tom, the owner, was a middle-aged man with grease-stained hands and a no-nonsense attitude. He looked me over as I nervously asked about the job. I'd never worked on cars before, but desperation pushed me to try. Tom didn't seem convinced at first, but he must have seen something in me, because he handed me a rag and told me to start cleaning tools. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. Over the weeks, I learned more than I ever expected. Tom wasn't just a boss, he became a mentor. He had a way of teaching that didn't make you feel stupid for not knowing something. Instead, he'd guide you step by step, showing you the ropes while sharing bits of his own life. He told me how he'd started with nothing, building the shop from the ground up. His story gave me hope: if he could do it, maybe I could too. Tom noticed I was staying late, long after my shifts ended. When he asked why, I admitted I didn't have anywhere to go. Without hesitation, he offered me a small room above the shop. It wasn't much, just a cot and a window that barely closed, but to me, it was freedom. For the first time, I had a space that was mine, no strings attached. It felt like a fresh start. Living at the shop wasn't easy, but it was better than anything I'd known before. I threw myself into the work, determined to make the most of this opportunity. I learned how to replace brakes, fix engines, and diagnose electrical problems. Tom's patience and encouragement made me believe in myself in ways I never had before. He'd often say, "Hard work pays off, Ethan. Just keep at it." Those words stuck with me. I also started saving every penny I could. With no rent to pay, I lived frugally, eating instant noodles and wearing the same clothes until they were threadbare. Every dollar I earned went into a savings account. It wasn't just about the money, it was about proving to myself that I could build something better. 3 years passed in what felt like a blur. By then, I wasn't just cleaning tools or changing tires. I was a skilled mechanic, trusted by customers and respected by my coworkers. Tom even let me take on more responsibilities, like managing the shop when he wasn't around. For someone who had spent most of their life feeling invisible, it was a strange but empowering feeling. The day I bought my own house was the proudest moment of my life. It wasn't anything fancy, a small, one-bedroom place on the edge of town, but it was mine. As I held the keys in my hand, I felt a surge of emotions I couldn't quite put into words. That house wasn't just a place to live, it was a symbol of everything I'd fought for. It was proof that I could carve out a life for myself, no matter how bleak things had once seemed. Moving into the house was surreal. I spent the first night sitting on the floor, surrounded by unpacked boxes, just taking it all in. The walls were bare, and the rooms echoed with emptiness, but it felt more like home than anywhere I'd ever been. I didn't need fancy furniture or decorations to make it perfect. What mattered was that it was mine, and no one could take it away from me. Looking back, I'm not sure where I'd be if I hadn't walked into Tom's Auto Repair that day. Tom didn't just teach me how to fix cars, he showed me what it meant to believe in someone, even when they didn't believe in themselves. He gave me a chance when no one else would, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Building a life from scratch wasn't easy, but it taught me that independence isn't just about having a place to live or a steady job. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone dictate what you can or can't achieve. That little house became my sanctuary, a place where I could dream of a future that was finally mine to shape. The day my parents showed up at my doorstep, I knew trouble was brewing. It had been years since I'd seen them, and their sudden appearance felt as out of place as rain in the desert. They stood there, looking slightly uncomfortable, with Lily's toddler balanced on her hip. My mother's eyes darted around, taking in the modest house I had worked so hard to call my own. My father looked as though he was swallowing a bitter pill. After the initial awkward pleasantries, they got straight to the point. My mother explained that Lily needed a better environment for her child, one with parks and a quiet neighborhood. She gestured toward the nearby park visible from my window, as if that alone justified their request. They wanted Lily and her child to move in with me. It wasn't framed as a question, more like a statement, as though my agreement was a foregone conclusion. The audacity of it all was almost laughable. These were the same people who had ignored me for years, who'd shoved me into a basement so Lily could have a nursery, who'd never once shown up for me when I needed them. And now they were asking me to open my home to the very person they had always prioritized over me? The irony wasn't lost on me. I told them no. I wasn't rude about it, but I made it clear that my answer wasn't up for debate. Their shocked faces were almost satisfying, as though they couldn't fathom the idea of me standing up to them. My mother started to argue, bringing up family obligations, and how it was my duty to help Lily in her time of need. My father chimed in, his tone sharp, accusing me of being selfish after all they had done for me. That last part stung, but not for the reasons they intended. It was a reminder of all the years I had spent yearning for their approval, of all the times I had swallowed my hurt to keep the peace. But I wasn't that person anymore. I'd built a life for myself from the ground up, without their help. I didn't owe them anything, and I wasn't going to let guilt pull me back into the shadows. I told them exactly that. I reminded them of how they had treated me growing up, how they had turned a blind eye to my achievements while celebrating Lily's every move. I described the nights spent in a cold, damp basement while Lily had the best room in the house. I spoke about the countless times they had dismissed me, ignored me, and made me feel like an outsider in my own family. They didn't take it well. My mother's face turned red, and she started raising her voice, accusing me of holding on to petty grudges. My father's jaw tightened, and he muttered something about how ungrateful I was. Lily stood there silently, not saying a word, though her expression flickered with something that looked like shame. Or maybe it was just discomfort at being caught in the middle. The old me might have backed down at this point. I might have let their anger and disappointment chip away at my resolve. But I wasn't that person anymore. I told them I had nothing more to say and asked them to leave. My voice was calm, but firm, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control of the situation. They didn't go quietly. My mother continued to argue, but my father eventually pulled her away, muttering something about how they didn't need this. As they walked back to their car, my mother threw one last parting shot, something about how I was going to regret this. I watched them drive away, feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was relief, of course, but also a lingering sadness. They were my family, after all, and a part of me had always hoped for some kind of reconciliation. But I knew now that it wasn't my responsibility to fix what they had broken. That evening, as I sat in my living room, I thought about everything that had led me to this moment. The years of neglect, the struggles to find my own path, the hard-won independence. Turning them away hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. For the first time, I felt like I was truly free from their influence. My house, my life, my choices, they were mine, and mine alone. It was a bittersweet victory, but a victory nonetheless. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: I would never again let anyone make me feel small or invisible. This was my life, and I was determined to live it on my own terms. One quiet evening, I decided to open a small box my grandfather had given me years ago, which was filled with photos, receipts, and other small mementos from his life. I had taken the box with me when I left home but had largely forgotten about it until now. Wanting to revisit the memories, I began sorting through its contents. Among the items, I discovered a folder tucked at the bottom. It was thick with documents, many of which seemed insignificant at first glance, old receipts, handwritten notes, and some faded photographs. But as I sifted through them, a legal document caught my eye. It was a will, written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, and it clearly stated that he had left me a significant portion of his savings, along with a small plot of land he had owned outside of town. At first, I thought it must be a mistake. My parents had never mentioned any inheritance, and I certainly hadn't received anything. As I read through the details, a mix of confusion and anger began to bubble up inside me. Why had this been hidden from me? What had happened to the money and the land my grandfather had intended for me? The next day, I made an appointment with Mr. Grant, a local attorney known for his thoroughness. When I showed him the documents, he immediately saw the red flags. He assured me he would look into it and began the process of tracing what had happened to my grandfather's assets. I didn't know what to expect, but I had a sinking feeling that my parents were involved. A week later, Mr. Grant called me into his office. His expression was grave as he explained what he had uncovered. My grandfather's inheritance had indeed been redirected, but not to me. Bank records showed that the money had been transferred to accounts in Lily's name shortly after my grandfather's death. The land had been sold, and the proceeds had been used to fund Lily's education and other expenses. It was clear my parents had orchestrated the entire thing, using their authority to override my grandfather's wishes. Hearing this felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about the money or the land, it was the betrayal, the realization that my own family had stolen from me. The same people who had ignored me and shoved me aside had taken what little my grandfather had left me, and they'd done it without a second thought. I couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about justice, it was about standing up for myself, for the boy who had been overlooked and dismissed for so long. With Mr. Grant's help, I filed a lawsuit against my parents. It was a surreal experience, sitting in a courtroom and listening to my family try to justify their actions. They claimed they had acted in Lily's best interests, that the money had been used to preserve the family's future. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements, transaction records, and even signed documents all pointed to their deceit. There was no denying the truth. The trial was emotionally exhausting. My parents' lawyer tried to paint me as ungrateful and vengeful, but the facts spoke for themselves. Witnesses corroborated my grandfather's intent, and Mr. Grant's meticulous preparation left no room for doubt. The judge's verdict was clear: my parents were ordered to repay the full value of the inheritance, along with additional damages for their fraudulent actions. Winning the case was a bittersweet victory. On one hand, I felt vindicated. For the first time, my voice had been heard, and the wrongs done to me had been acknowledged. On the other hand, it was a stark reminder of just how broken my relationship with my family had become. They had chosen to betray me, and while I had won the legal battle, the emotional scars ran deep. With the compensation, I was able to secure my financial future. I invested in expanding my skills, took a few courses in business management, and even started planning to open my own small auto repair shop. But more importantly, I found a sense of closure. The money wasn't what mattered most, it was the fact that I had stood up for myself and refused to let my family's actions define me. Looking back, I'm grateful to my grandfather, not just for what he left me, but for the lessons he taught me about integrity and resilience. His inheritance wasn't just about material things, it was a reminder that I was worth something, that I mattered. And no one, not even my own parents, could take that away from me. After the victory, I decided to completely sever ties with my toxic family, freeing myself from their influence once and for all. I invested the compensation into my business, developing new relationships based on mutual support, respect, and honesty. My life began to take on a new shape, one that felt entirely my own. Reflecting on the journey, I realized how much I had grown. The struggles and betrayals had made me stronger, and I often thought about my grandfather, who had always believed in me. His faith in me was the foundation upon which I built my new life. In the end, I came to understand that family isn't necessarily defined by blood but by the people who truly care about you. Those are the relationships that matter most.